Tonight, on the north end of Las Vegas Boulevard, there is a tower of blue glass 67 stories high, lit from the inside, full of people who paid to be there. By the summer of 2009, roughly $2 billion had already gone into that building. Concrete, steel, elevators, a topped-out frame standing against the desert sky. A few months later, a single man bought the whole of it for about $150 million. That is roughly 8 cents on the dollar. $2 billion of building, sold for the price of a rounding error, and then left to sit. It sat because a finished-looking tower is not a finished hotel, and for the next 14 years, nobody could pay the difference. The building is still there. It opened in December of 2023, and the steel and the blue glass you walk past today are the same steel and blue glass that were raised before the last recession. That is the Fontainebleau. Every person who has held that deed saw in it exactly what they needed to see, and every one of them so far has been wrong about what it would take to open it. This is a story about $2 billion already in the ground and the man who bought all of it for about 8 cents on the dollar. About a tower a father renamed for the son he had lost, a name that would come down 3 years later. About furniture that welcomed guests somewhere else, 13 years before this building opened a single door. And about 1,800 finished rooms that had to be gutted to the studs before anyone could sleep in one. Nothing supernatural ever touched this building. It was beaten 4 times by the most ordinary forces in Las Vegas: a recession, a virus, a calendar, and 4 men who each believed they had bought a bargain. To understand how $2 billion ends up selling for $150, you have to go back to the spring of 2000 and a stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard that the developer next door could not stand to look at. In May of that year, Jeffrey Soffer paid $45 million for 21 acres and a dead casino called the El Rancho. Not because he wanted to build anything on it yet, but because from the windows of the luxury towers he was selling next door, it had become, in his words, a real eyesore. The thing to understand about this stretch of the Strip in the year 2000 is that nobody was fighting over it. The land had a long history of dying on the people who owned it. It had opened in 1948 as the Thunderbird, one of the early strip casinos, back when the boulevard was mostly desert and low neon and open sky. Over the next half-century, it wore other names: the Thunderbird, the Silverbird, the El Rancho, and each of them failed in its turn. The last of them went dark in 1992 and simply sat, boarded and browning in the sun, for 8 years. What Soffer bought in 2000 then was not a business. It was a corpse on a valuable corner. The old structure came down that same year, imploded and scraped to bare dirt, and the arithmetic of the deal, for its time, was not extravagant. $45 million for 21 acres works out to a little over $2 million an acre, about $49 a square foot. Adjusted into today's money, that $45 million is somewhere around $87 million. For frontage on Las Vegas Boulevard, none of that was reckless. It was a wealthy man buying the empty lot next door because he had the cash and he did not like the view. And here is the detail that will matter more than any other 14 years from now. Hold on to the word Soffer used: eyesore. The empty lot he could not stand to look at was about to become the most famous empty building in the history of Las Vegas. and it would stay empty far longer than the El Rancho ever had. The location was the entire logic of the purchase. The parcel sat directly against Turnberry Place, the cluster of high-end residential towers Soffer's own organization had built and was still selling, so the eyesore he was clearing was, quite literally, the view he was selling to his own buyers, and it sat within easy reach of the Las Vegas Convention Center, the machine that fills North Strip rooms on a Tuesday in February when the rest of the town runs quiet. This was not a bet on a frontier. It was in Phil, on a corner where Soffer already owned half the skyline. The first idea for the land was not a Fontainebleau at all. In 2001, there was a plan for a London-themed resort on the site. Then 2 towers came down in New York, tourism to Las Vegas cratered, and the plan went with it. The land had already killed one idea. For a few years, the corner did nothing. Then, in March of 2005, the developers bought the piece beside it, the old Algiers parcel, and here the record stops agreeing with itself. Contemporary reports put the price somewhere between $95 and $97 million for somewhere between 3 and 3.5 acres. Take the larger set of figures, and the ground now ran to nearly $27 million an acre, more than 10 times what the El Rancho land had cost 5 years earlier. Whichever numbers are right, the message is the same. The corner had stopped being cheap. Put the 2 purchases together, and Soffer's group had assembled around 25 acres of prime North Strip dirt for something close to $140 million. Call it under $6 million an acre across the whole assembly. It was, by the standards of the corner, a great deal of money and a great deal of land. But the buying was the easy part, and it was almost the only part of this story that ever went smoothly. Land on the North Strip had one enormous thing going for it and one enormous thing against it. In its favor, the convention center a short walk away, and beyond that, the whole apparatus of a city built to move millions of people through a few square miles. Against it, this end of the boulevard had a long habit of swallowing ambitious projects whole, and the graveyard on this exact corner was 50 years deep. 3 names had gone up over this ground, and 3 names had come down. The lot was cleared, the lot was combined. Now somebody had to decide what to put on it. Here is where the story turns on one decision, made by 2 men in 2005. On the 12th of May that year, the plan for the corner was announced, and it carried a name borrowed from Miami Beach, the Fontainebleau. The Las Vegas Sun reported it as a partnership. Turnberry, Schaefer plan new resort. And the second name in that headline is the one that turned Soffer's empty lot into a casino. Glenn Schaefer was a gaming executive who had helped run some of the largest resort companies in the state, and his arrival is what moved the project from a developer's real estate holding to a serious bid for the Strip itself. The number attached to it that day was about $1.5 billion. Understand the counterfactual, because the entire rest of this story hangs from it. Without that announcement, the El Rancho land stays a graded lot, or a parking apron beside Turnberry Place, or it gets flipped to some other buyer. There is no $2 billion sunk cost. There is no bankruptcy. There is no ghost tower, and there is no chain of owners taking turns being wrong about what it was. The whole 16-year saga begins with 2 men deciding to build the most expensive thing on that end of the boulevard. The name itself was a claim about what the place would be. The original Fontainebleau, designed by the architect Maurice Lapidus and opened on Miami Beach in the 1950s, was a monument to a particular kind of American glamour, curved, extravagant, unmistakable. Reaching back for that name was a promise, and the promise was expensive. Nobody builds a copy of a legend on the cheap, and nobody involved intended to try. That was the trap hiding inside the ambition. A modest project can absorb a bad year. A project that has already told the world it will be the most expensive thing on its stretch of the Strip has no cheap version to retreat to. Every choice that made the Fontainebleau grander also made it heavier. More rooms, more marble, more debt against a single opening date that was still years away. Because the number would not hold still. The $1.5 billion of the announcement did not survive contact with the actual drawings. As the design grew, the estimates climbed toward 2.8 and then $2.9 billion, and the debt had to grow to match. Construction began in February of 2007. That spring, an Australian company, Publishing and Broadcasting Limited, put $250 million into the project for a minority stake, and in June of 2007, the main financing closed, a package led by Bank of America and a large syndicate of lenders. Remember that financing, because it is the machine the whole tower runs on, and in 2 years, when it stops turning, the tower stops with it. On the day the money closed, none of that was visible. On that day, it was simply the most ambitious project on the North Strip, fully funded, steel about to go vertical, $1.5 billion of ambition already grown to nearly $3 billion. The proposition had become an obligation. Picture the North Strip in the summer of 2007. For about 2 years, the Fontainebleau site was one of the busiest places on the boulevard. The $250 million from Publishing and Broadcasting Limited was in the ground. The Bank of America financing had closed in June. Cranes stood over the corner, trucks lined the access roads, and a blue glass tower began to climb, floor by floor, on a frame that would eventually reach 67 stories. This was the golden age of the Fontainebleau, and it is worth being exact about what that golden age consisted of, because this building never had a single paying guest during it. Its golden age was a construction site. The plans were vast, and they kept growing. By the time the design settled, the resort was meant to hold more than 3,600 rooms. There was to be a convention complex of roughly 550,000 square feet, a theater seating close to 3,800, and a spa of some 55,000 square feet. A small city stacked vertically on 25 acres. Everything about the program was built to a superlative, because the name on the door was a superlative, and a copy of the Miami Fontainebleau could not open as anything modest. Building something that large, that fast, takes money and bodies, both in enormous quantity. At its height, the project would carry thousands of construction workers, a workforce the size of a town, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, day after day, for years. Every one of those days cost money whether the tower rose or not, and the whole enterprise was a race between the pace of the build and the patience of the lenders. As long as the money kept flowing and the floors kept stacking, the race was even. The blue curtain wall that is still the building's signature today was the work of the architect Carlos Zapata. Remember that skin. Of everything drawn, poured, and bolted in these years, Zapata's exterior is the one thing that would survive every owner, every bankruptcy, and every name the building would ever wear. Behind it, the interior was a copy of an idea. Morris Lapidus's Miami original, rebuilt for the Mojave. Everything about it was designed to be arrived at, not merely used. The plan put the theater, the convention floors, the spa, and the casino under one blue skin so a guest could land at the airport in the morning and never have a reason to leave the property before the flight home. That is the whole logic of a modern mega resort, a machine for keeping people and their money inside. It was a good plan. It was also a plan that only pays for itself the day the doors open, and the doors were still years away. Here is what the renderings left out. The cost of building that fast on that scale was never measured only in dollars. In July of 2007, roughly 70 ironworkers walked off the job for a time over safety concerns. The men who actually bolt the frame together, deciding the frame was not safe enough to keep bolting. The next month, a worker died after a fall on the site, and Nevada's Occupational Safety Office opened an investigation. On the 6th of August, 2007, concrete slabs gave way in the garage area, and more workers were hurt. The reporting on those accidents ran in the Honolulu Advertiser, among other papers, not hidden but not printed on any billboard. The site had already cost a life before it ever topped out. And then there was the matter of the neighbors, which begins here in the Golden Age with nothing more than geography. The Fontainebleau was rising directly against Turnberry Place, the same luxury towers Soffer's organization had built, sold, and filled with residents who had paid for a view and a certain quiet. Among them were Robert and Gail Pohl, who could watch the new tower climb floor by floor from their own windows, and what went up first, nearest to them, was not the glittering hotel with the curved blue skin. It was the parking garage. By November of 2008, the main tower had reached its full height. 67 stories of blue glass now stood over the North Strip, visible from the airport, visible from the freeway, visible from every window in Turnberry Place. On paper, the Fontainebleau was more than half built and racing toward an opening date. It had the money, the frame, the architect, the name, and the location. Everything a project could want. Everything except a working peace with the people next door. And, as of that autumn, everything except a lender still willing to pay for the rest. Next door, the neighbors were watching every floor go up, and some of them had already called their lawyers. A word about the neighbors. The Fontainebleau was supposed to be the prestige address at the top of the strip, and Turnberry Place was supposed to be its natural partner. The same developer, the same money, the same corner of the same boulevard. Instead, the residents of Turnberry Place became the first people to take the Fontainebleau to court. The quarrel was about the garage. To serve a resort of that size, the developers planned a parking structure large enough to loom over the residential towers beside it, and the people in those towers did not want it that tall, that close, or that near their windows and the views they had paid a premium to keep. Understand what a parking garage means to a resort this size. 3,600 rooms, a convention hall, a theater, and a casino floor all have to put their cars somewhere, and somewhere on 25 crowded acres means up a concrete slab wall rising floor after floor, right at the property line, right where the Turnberry Towers had their windows. The people who had paid for high-floor views were about to have a garage for a neighbor. By October of 2007, the dispute was in the courts, and the residents who pressed it left their names in the record: Robert and Gail Pohl, Julie Stapleton, Ann Stager, and Cheryl and Stan Tomchin. Their attorney, J.T. Moran, argued the case, and it came before Clark County Judge Michael Villani. Read the list of plaintiffs and the strangeness of it comes into focus. The people suing him had bought their homes from him. This was a developer being taken to court by his own buyers over a building he was raising beside the building he had already sold them. Soffer's public position was blunt, and it is the sentence this whole story eventually turns against. Defending the project against the neighbors, he made the case that the land could not simply sit there. "We're not going to buy a 20-acre property," he said, "and leave it as a vacant lot." By April of 2008, the two sides were negotiating rather than only fighting, and the developers put money on the table. Mitigation for the impact of the garage reported at up to $7 million. $7 million to make the neighbors whole for a parking structure on a project already tracking toward $3 billion. The dispute cooled. The garage went up. The residents stayed in their towers, and the tower next to them kept climbing. For a few months in 2008, that looked like the whole conflict: a rich developer, his rich neighbors, and an argument about a garage and a view. It was not the whole conflict. It was the last argument anyone would have about this building for a very long time, because within a year there would be nothing to argue over. There would only be a stop tower and the question of who now owned the debt. Now hold that quote about the vacant lot, because it is about to curdle into something no one in that courtroom could have predicted. The developer's own condo buyers were the first people to go to court against his casino, and the garage they fought would outlast the recession, standing all but empty beside them for the next 14 years. Soffer had promised he would not leave 20 acres as a vacant lot. He was about to leave them the most conspicuous vacant building in Las Vegas. Then the credit markets froze. The event that hit the Fontainebleau was the same one that hit everything in the autumn of 2008. The financial crisis, the seizing up of credit, the sudden refusal of lenders to advance another dollar against anything. Las Vegas has always been built on borrowed money, on the confidence that the next quarter would be bigger than the last, and in the autumn of 2008, that confidence evaporated across the entire economy at once. In most versions of this kind of story, the outside disaster arrives. The subject takes the blow, survives it, and only then reaches its peak. This is the inversion of that story. Here the disaster did not come and go. It came and it stayed, and it arrived at the exact moment the tower reached the top, because the tower did reach the top. In November of 2008, in the teeth of the crisis, the main structure topped out at its full height, 67 stories, about 737 feet of blue glass against the desert sky, the most expensive resort then rising on the North Strip, its projected cost by now near $2.9 billion. It reached its full height and could not be paid for. The peak and the wound were the same moment. The problem was specific, and it was fatal. A project this large does not hold its own money in a vault. It draws it down in stages, advance after advance, as the work is done. When credit froze, the advances that were supposed to keep coming stopped coming, and a half-built tower with no more money to draw is not an asset. It is a very expensive stall. Everything after that happened in the language of lawsuits. In April of 2009, the Fontainebleau companies sued their own lenders, alleging that roughly $800 million of committed financing was being withheld, money the project needed to finish, promised on paper, and then, they said, held back at the worst possible time. Within weeks, the litigation widened, drawing in more banks and, briefly, allegations aimed at a competing resort across the boulevard, claims that were later dropped and belong in this account only as litigation, never as established fact. None of it turned the money back on. On the 9th of June 2009, Fontainebleau, Las Vegas filed for bankruptcy. Chapter 11 in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Florida, the case logged in that court's files under the number 09-21482. 2 days later, the construction halt was official. The frame stood at roughly 70% complete, and the men who had been building it went home. Think about the arithmetic of that moment. Somewhere near $2 billion had gone into the ground, into steel and concrete and elevators and rooms. The workforce the size of a town was dismissed. The cranes stopped. $1.5 billion of announced ambition, grown to nearly $3 billion of projected cost, had produced exactly one thing: a very tall, very expensive, very unfinished building, and a stack of lawsuits over who owed what to whom. On the 11th of June, 2009, the site went quiet. 70%. Hold that number alongside the eyesore and the vacant lot. It is the figure every buyer for the next 14 years would repeat to himself as the reason this was a bargain. It is also the figure this story is about to take apart. But here's the fact that the phrase 70% complete hid for the next 14 years. A building does not pause, it ages, and every year the tower stood dark, the 70% got smaller. Think about what 70% complete actually described in June of 2009. A topped-out frame, a finished curtain wall, installed elevators, and on many floors, hotel rooms that were, by the standard of that year, close to done. That was the figure Carl Icahn relied on when, in January of 2010, he won the bankrupt property at auction for about $150 million, roughly 8 cents on the dollar against the $2 billion already spent. It was the figure the next buyer would rely on, and the buyer after him. Each looked at a 70% building and ran the same simple sum: pay for the final 30%, open the doors, keep the difference. The sum was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that took years to surface. A stalled building is not a frozen asset waiting for someone to switch on the lights. Codes change, fire and life safety systems change. The technology that runs a modern hotel room, the wiring, the door locks, the networks a guest never sees, moves on and leaves the old work stranded. Fixtures, date, finishes yellow. What was 70% finished in 2009 became, with every passing year, a smaller and smaller share of a building anyone could actually open to the public. The proof would not arrive until the revival, and it deserves to be stated plainly and sourced plainly. According to the reporting on the project's eventual completion, roughly 1,800 rooms that had already been built out had to be stripped back and rebuilt because a decade of change had made them unusable. Finished rooms, torn to the studs, not because anyone had damaged them, but because time had walked past them while they sat in the dark. This is the part that makes the ghost tower different from every other stalled project. Most half-finished buildings are a pause, a bet that the money will come back and the work will resume where it left off. The Fontainebleau was not a pause. It was a slow subtraction. The longer it waited to be rescued, the less of it there was left to rescue, and the more any rescue would cost. A building that costs more to finish the longer it waits is a building designed almost to defeat its owners. The aging was visible from the boulevard to anyone who knew what to look for. In 2013, cameras were let inside the dormant tower, and what they found was a monument in suspension. Corridors and rooms and raw concrete that had simply stopped mid-sentence. In May of 2014, they took the crane down, the single construction crane that had stood over the boulevard for years, the last visible promise that anyone still meant to finish this, came down and did not go back up. By 2015, the lower floors were wrapped in cosmetic covering, a mask stretched over a building that was doing nothing at all. Icahn, for his part, did not seem to be in any hurry to test the math. He had bought the property cheap, and cheap enough that he did not need it to open in order to win. He could hold it, mothball it, and wait for someone else to want it more than he did, which is exactly what he did for the better part of a decade. Meanwhile, up and down the Strip, newer towers opened, filled, and turned their first profits. This one stood dark through every one of those openings. And here is what everyone who bought it after this misread. The thing Icahn's $150 million bargain, and every bargain after it got exactly wrong. The tower was not waiting to be finished. It was quietly unfinishing itself, one obsolete floor at a time, while 3 billionaires took turns calling it a bargain. The only part of it not aging into uselessness was the outside, Carlos Zapata's blue skin, the one decision from the golden age that time could not spoil. Everything behind it drifted further from an open door with each year that passed. And the man who had signed for that 70% tower, Jeffrey Soffer, was already gone. For now. Gone. And in his place came a man with no intention of finishing anything. Plenty of investors buy a broken building to fix it. Carl Icahn bought this one to leave it broken. In January of 2010, he won the bankrupt property at auction, and by February, he was in control of a tower that had already swallowed $2 billion. The price, as reported by the trade outlet Hotel Online, was about $150 million. He had not walked in unopposed. Among the bidders circling the corpse was a San Francisco real estate figure named Luke Brugnara, and the contest ran through a bankruptcy that had grown almost too tangled to read. In the autumn of 2009, the court had appointed an examiner simply to map the capital structure. Layers of senior and junior lenders stacked on top of one another, each holding a different claim on the same unfinished tower, sorting out who was owed what, and taking the whole thing for less than any of them believed it was worth was the entire game, and it was one he had played and won many times before. Icahn's specialty, across a long career, was exactly this, the distressed asset nobody else could untangle. He did not need the Fontainebleau to become a hotel. He needed it to become someone else's problem, someday at a higher price than he had paid. And for that, The building did not have to open. It only had to survive and keep its address. And survive it did. Through the years Icahn held title, the tower became a fixture of the skyline, photographed, filmed, and speculated over, a landmark of failure its owner never had to lift a hammer to profit from. So he took it apart on paper instead of finishing it in concrete. In April of 2010, the case was converted from a reorganization into a liquidation, a Chapter 7, under that same Florida case number, and the question stopped being how to open the Fontainebleau and became how to carve it up. That October, the unused furnishings were sold off, a detail that returns later in a place nobody would expect. The tower itself was left to stand and to wait. Through the first half of the decade, it sat dark and for sale, carrying an asking figure reported around $650 million. Meanwhile, up and down the Strip, newer resorts opened, filled, and paid for themselves, while this one did nothing but hold its silence and its price. For 7 years, that was the whole plan. Wait. The wait paid. In August of 2017, Icahn sold the property to a New York investor group for $600 million against the roughly $150 million he had put in, a gross spread of around $450 million. Say it plainly. That is a gross price difference, not an audited profit, and 7 years of carrying costs are nowhere in the public record. However it is counted, the arithmetic of the whole saga bends around this one man. Everyone else poured money into the Fontainebleau. Icahn is the one who pulled money out, precisely because he never once tried to open it. This is the moment to talk about a father and a son. The buyer in August of 2017 was Stephen Witkoff, a New York developer whose group paid $600 million for the tower Icahn had never switched on. Witkoff did not see a position to unwind. He saw a building to finish, and he said so, calling it, in remarks reported by Hotel Online, one of the best physical assets in the country. Where Icahn had seen pieces to hold, Witkoff saw a resort to raise from the dead. He also saw a memorial. In February of 2018, on the 12th, he announced the project would open under a new name, the Drew Las Vegas, for his late son, Andrew. The choice carries weight that is handled in full further on. Here it is enough to say the building now wore a private grief as its public name, and that the man behind it meant to finish what 4 years of ownership under Icahn never had. The relaunch came with the machinery of a real opening. Marriott signed on that same month its executive Tony Capuano, attaching the chain's name to the resort. A former Cosmopolitan executive, John Unwin, was brought in through a hospitality venture to run it. And in 2019, Bobby Baldwin, one of the most established operators in the state, was recruited to help lead the launch. On paper, the Drew had everything the Fontainebleau once had: money, a name, a global brand, and a plan. What it did not yet have was the one thing that had failed the first project at the very end: a lender willing to pay for the last stretch. The building fought back the whole way. In March of 2018, a trespasser set a fire inside the vacant complex. The damage was reported from a single account, so take it as that, at around $10 million. A vacant tower that large is a liability standing perfectly still, and this one had now caught fire while it waited to be saved. The opening date, first set for 2020, began to slide, and by April of 2019, it had drifted toward 2022. In January of 2020, Witkoff's group cleared Nevada's suitability review as it worked to close the financing that would carry the resort over the line. Then, a virus closed the strip. In March of 2020, the pandemic stopped the work, and the financing that was supposed to close did not. Contractor claims reported by the trade press ran to around $36 million. The Drew, named, branded, staffed, and financed almost to the finish, never opened a single door. 2 owners now, and between them, not one working entrance. The story was not done with its first owner. In February of 2021, Soffer came back. His Fontainebleau development, partnered with the investment arm of Koch Industries, reacquired the property out of the distressed debt process for a figure that Howard Stutz of the Nevada Independent reported at around $350 million, less than either of the last 2 buyers had paid for a building that had aged another 3 years in the dark. The first thing to go was the name. The Drew came down. Fontainebleau went back up. There was an irony in the number that Soffer, of all people, must have felt. He had lost a project with $2 billion sunk into it, and he was buying it back more than a decade later for a fraction of that sum, having watched 2 other men fail in turn to do the one thing he was now going to try. Then came the money, and this time it held. On the 9th of November 2021, the partnership held a ceremony to restart construction with roughly 3,200 workers tied to the site, the town-sized workforce back on a corner that had sat silent for more than a decade. The Capital Partners' public face was Jacob Francis, president of Koch's real estate arm, and it was his group's balance sheet that made the difference the lawsuits of 2009 never could. The financing that followed was the largest the project had ever carried. On the 23rd of December 2022, the partnership announced $2.2 billion in completion funding from a syndicate that read like a roll call of Wall Street: J.P. Morgan, Sumitomo, Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, Guggenheim, and the casino landlord VC. Francis called it, in the announcement carried by Business Wire, proof of the widespread confidence in this project. After 16 years, confidence had finally grown cheaper than doubt. Where the 2007 financing had been a single package that failed all at once, this one spread the risk across a syndicate too large and too varied to blink. Stand in front of the site that winter and the change was visible from the street. The fence that had wrapped the block for years came down. The lights came on in the tower after dark, and the blue glass that had reflected nothing for a decade began, floor by floor, to show a building being finished from the inside out. And here, the promise made at the very beginning comes due. The first thing they did to the finished rooms was tear them apart. According to the reporting on the completion, roughly 1,800 rooms that had been built out in the first construction had to be gutted and rebuilt because, while the tower stood dark, the 70% had quietly kept shrinking. The bargain every owner had counted on had become a bill, and Soffer was the one who finally paid it. The most nearly finished part of the building was the first part that had to be destroyed. He paid it, and he opened it. On the 13th of December, 2023, the Fontainebleau, Las Vegas, opened to the public at a final cost of about $3.7 billion. Soffer, speaking to the Nevada Independent, said he felt very privileged and honored to be in this situation. 16 years after the announcement, 14 and a half after the site went quiet, the doors finally worked. And unlike the two men before him, this owner did not sell into the moment of victory. He kept it. Everyone wanted to call it cursed. The record calls it something duller. For 14 years, the ghost tower had invited a certain kind of story. A haunted high-rise, a jinxed corner, a lot the desert would not let anyone finish. Nothing supernatural is required. A recession froze the credit. A lender dispute went to court. A bankruptcy split the ownership. Completion economics turned a bargain into a bill. Obsolescence ate the interior, and a pandemic stopped the one owner who came closest. The only reason the Fontainebleau became a legend when 100 quieter failures did not is that it failed in public and at full height. Most collapses vanish onto a balance sheet. This one stood 67 stories over the strip, in blue glass, where nobody could look away. What stands there now is real and specific. 3,644 rooms, 67 stories, about $3.7 billion, opened in December of 2023. The same blue tower from 2008, and at its opening, the tallest occupiable building in Nevada, though the stratosphere's observation tower rises higher overall. In signage alone, it had traveled a full circle. Fontainebleau, then the Drew, then Fontainebleau again. And here is who actually made money. Not Soffer, who paid the most, nor Witkoff, whom a virus stopped, but Carl Icahn, roughly $150 million in and $600 million out. The one owner who won by refusing to play the game the others lost. One correction belongs on the record against the label this project is so often given. The Fontainebleau was not the most expensive resort in Las Vegas. Down the boulevard, Resorts World had opened at a cost the Associated Press put nearer $4.3 billion, beaten to that superlative as it had been beaten to almost everything else. The opening was a spectacle, with Tom Brady, Justin Timberlake, Cher, and Paul Anka among the names in the building that December. Then the saga simply changed shape. Within weeks, the leadership that opened the place began to leave. By January of 2024, President Mark Tricano was out, replaced by Maurice Wooden, and with him went the operating chief, Colleen Birch, the marketing chief, Shane Smith, the revenue head, Angie Daubney, and the casino operations lead, Michael Clifford, most inside the first weeks, as reported by Skift meetings. The construction saga had ended, a management saga had started. What follows is allegation, not finding, and belongs on the record as exactly that. On the 29th of February, 2024, Wynn Resorts sued, claiming the Fontainebleau had improperly recruited its executives, contested claims, not proven facts. In May of 2025, Wooden told regulators in testimony reported by CDC Gaming, "We're a much different property than we were in 2024, even as the same proceedings noted an ongoing anti-money laundering audit and a question over a customer credit decision, matters the company said it was cooperating on, with no adverse finding on the public record." Whether the resort inherited the building's deepest problem is what the anecdotes keep poking at. The discounting, the quiet floors, the guest whose $21 order of nachos went briefly viral. Those are stories, not audited numbers, and should be held as stories, which leaves the verdict, and it is not a moral, it is structural. The distance between a building and a business cannot be borrowed against. It has to be crossed floor by floor, dollar by dollar, and for 16 years, that crossing was the most expensive real estate in Las Vegas. The man who bought the land because a dead casino was an eyesore had built the North Strip's most famous eyesore, watched it stand empty for 14 years through two other owners, and then come back and opened it himself. A word about the furniture. Returned to that liquidation under Icahn in October of 2010. In its first construction, the Fontainebleau had already bought furnishings for its rooms, beds, case goods, the fittings of guest rooms that so far existed only on paper. When the tower went into liquidation, all of it belonged to a man with no plan to use any of it, sitting in inventory inside a building that had no opening date and, at that point, no likely future. It is one of the odder inventories in the city's history. An entire hotel's worth of new furniture, bought, delivered, and never once used. Somewhere in that dark tower sat the beds and chairs of a resort that had never rented a single room. A few miles off the Strip downtown, the Plaza Hotel and Casino was in the middle of its own renovation, and its leadership saw the opportunity in someone else's dead hotel. The Plaza's chief executive, Tony Santo, bought the unused Fontainebleau furnishings for the remodel. Strip-grade goods at a liquidation price in an account reported at the time by the Las Vegas Sun. Keep the claim precisely where the reporting leaves it. The furniture went downtown. Which specific pieces landed where, and whether any outlasted the renovations that came after, is not something the record tracks. The plaza sits about as far from the Fontainebleau in spirit as two casinos in one city can. Old downtown against the North Strip, a working renovation against a $3 billion monument. For a while, the same order of furniture was bound for both. Only one of them had guests to sit in it. But the shape of it is the whole saga in miniature. Part of the Fontainebleau checked in its first guests at the plaza in 2010, 13 years before the Fontainebleau checked in a single guest of its own. A building that could not open had sent its furniture ahead to open somewhere else, downtown, under another name, for another company, while the tower it had been bought for stood dark on the boulevard. It may be the only part of the original Fontainebleau that ever went to work on schedule. There is one name on this building that was never about money. Of everything ever fixed to the tower, the billions, the lawsuits, the owners taking their turns, only one mark on it was purely human. In February of 2018, when Witkoff renamed the resurrection the Drew, he named it for his son, Andrew, who had died. That is the fact, and it is the whole of the fact the record supports. He had died before his father ever put the name on the building. Past that, this account will not go. The rest belongs to a family, not to a documentary. What can be said is only what was done in public. A father bought a dead building for $600 million, staked his family's name on bringing it back to life, and put his son's name across 67 stories of glass. Every other decision in this story was an investment, made to be recovered. This one was not. For 3 years, the marquee on the North Strip carried a private name, legible to anyone driving past, meaningful to almost no one but the family that chose it. The naming was announced, reported, and mounted in letters on the tower. That much is public. That much is all. The name lasted 3 years. When Soffer returned in February of 2021, the Drew came down and the Fontainebleau name went back up. Of all the things done to this building across 16 years, the sales, the bankruptcies, the gut renovations, the memorial was the easiest thing to remove. The pandemic had already taken the opening the name was building toward. The next owner took the name itself. A memorial depends on the thing it is carved into, staying what it was, and this one did not. The building outlived the tribute set upon it and kept none of it. Today, there is no Drew on the North Strip, no marquee, no signage, nothing. And the name existed on the tower for exactly the span between one owner's grief and the next owner's return. Drive north on Las Vegas Boulevard today, past the convention center, and the tower is impossible to miss. 67 stories of blue glass, lit from the inside, open for business at the address 2777 South Las Vegas Boulevard. It has been open since December of 2023, and it has not stopped adding to itself since. There is a members club and event space unveiled in 2025, a station on the underground Vegas Loop opened in February of 2026, a restaurant that seated its first tables that March, and a Michelin key hung on the hotel the year before. The building that spent 14 years as the emptiest address on the Strip is now one of its busiest. Inside, 3,644 rooms take guests every night. The same count the first plans imagined, in the same tower, behind the same skin. What is missing now is the emptiness itself. Gone is the fence, the boarded lobby, the dark tower, the single crane that stood over the boulevard for years, the wrapped and silent lower floors, and the abandoned shell that filmmakers once borrowed as a set. All of it gone. The absence is the absence. The steel and the blue glass you passed tonight are the same steel and blue glass that were raised before the last recession. This is the tower Icahn owned and never opened, the one Witkoff renamed and could not finish, the one Soffer signed for, lost, and bought back 16 years later. Everything behind the glass is new, the interior torn out and rebuilt, the systems replaced, the 1,800 rooms that aged in the dark, gutted and remade. Everything in front of it is exactly as it was. The blue skin from 2008 is the one witness that never left. 3 men owned this shell, and 2 of them never opened it. The one who finally did was the same man who bought the eyesore next door a quarter century earlier just to make it go away. It is Carlos Zapata's skin, unchanged, wrapped around an interior torn out and rebuilt behind it. The artifact from the start of this story is not a ruin in a boneyard somewhere. It is the building itself, finally open. A grudge over an eyesore became a billion-dollar tower. A billion-dollar tower became a bankruptcy. A bankruptcy became a billionaire's holding. A holding became a father's memorial. A memorial became a construction site again. A construction site became the tallest open door in Nevada. Every owner who held that deed believed he had solved it. And the doors are open now. 67 stories of blue glass lit from within on the north end of the Strip, full of people who will never know that the rooms they are sleeping in were torn down once before anyone slept in them, in a building that once sold for the price of a rounding error and then took 4 owners and 16 years to open a single door. A door that is open tonight, and whether that is the same thing as solving it is a question the next owner will answer.